Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Compliance Reality, where we discuss the reality of compliance enforcement and compliance programs today. Our session today is Compliance Programs for Small Medical Practices. I'm Dr. CJ Wolf, and I have over 22 years of professional compliance experience working for organizations such as Intermountain Healthcare, the University of Texas System, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and an international medical device company. I also teach as faculty at the universities, and I'm doing a lot of work now as a private compliance and coding consultant and trainer. I have multiple certifications in the coding field as well as in the compliance field. If you are in need of our help, please reach out to us at info@compliancereality.com. So I want to talk today about compliance programs for small physician practices. Many large organizations have the resources to set up and maybe hire a full-time compliance officer and additional staff, and that's not always expected of a small physician practice. And so we're going to talk today about the efforts that small physician practices can make, and they should make. They should still have some compliance programs and compliance efforts, but how might they differ when you're maybe a single physician practice or a small physician practice where you don't have the resources to hire somebody full-time, and you might just not have the bandwidth to do all that. So let's first talk about compliance programs. And we're going to use a lot of references from the OIG, the Office of the Inspector General. They are somewhat of a watchdog, if you will, in the healthcare space. And they've published compliance guidance. And they've published compliance guidance for different provider types. So they have hospital guidance documents. They have nursing home documents, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and they have published one for small physician practices. And one of the things that they say that I think is spot on is physicians should view compliance programs as analogous to practicing preventive medicine for their practice. As docs, you are always preaching preventive medicine, and it's now time to kind of practice a little preventive medicine in the compliance world. It's so much better to prevent things from happening and going wrong than making some sort of compliance misstep and then having fines, and you have to hire consultants and attorneys and work through all sorts of things, and it becomes very disruptive. It's so much better to prevent in the first place. So the document I'm focusing a lot of my comments on comes from the OIG, and it's the Compliance Guidance for Individual and Small Group Physician Practices. I've provided the link here, and if you're just listening to the podcast, all the links will be in the show notes, and you can also always view this on YouTube if you're just listening to the podcast, and then you can see the slides. So we're going to talk about the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, and that's what this document does. It goes through their 7 known elements of an effective compliance program, and they apply those 7 elements to the unique circumstances of an individual or small group physician practice. And I was actually meeting with an individual the other day who is in a smaller practice and, is getting to the point where they're growing a little bit, and they're like, do we hire a full-time compliance officer? What do we do? We're right on that edge, right? And so we sat down, and it got me thinking after talking to them, like, I bet other people need some advice on what to do when you're a small physician practice and you may not be able to hire a full-time compliance officer. What tools are out there? What things could you do? And so that's why I thought I'd put this program together today. The OIG feels that this guidance document will serve as a positive step towards assisting providers in preventing the submission of erroneous claims or engaging in unlawful conduct involving the federal healthcare programs. That's really the crux of this guidance document. It's focused on, being compliant with laws and regulations as it relates to healthcare. And some of the biggest areas are coding and billing, submission of claims to the federal government through Medicare, Medicaid, those types of programs. And, another big one is HIPAA. So I've kind of limited our time today to a couple major areas. Every practice may be a little different, and it's really good to do a risk assessment to find out where your risks are. You may be strong in coding and billing, and you don't focus all your time then there. You may be, weaker in a certain area. So doing a risk assessment or hiring somebody to do a risk assessment is a great way to kind of get a broad overview of where your compliance program needs some strengthening. Let's talk about the 7 elements, though. So these are the 7 elements of an effective compliance program according to the OIG, and these same elements are used in their guidance documents for hospitals and for ambulance companies and third-party billing companies, all these different entities. And as I mentioned, there's some leeway here for physicians. The OIG, I'm going to read some of the statements that they make, but here are the 7 elements. The first one is conducting internal monitoring and auditing. The second is implementing compliance and practice standards. So those might be policies and procedures that are written down that people can refer to. The third is designating a compliance officer or some sort of contact. Again, if you don't have the resources for like a full-time compliance officer, maybe somebody in the office can act as the compliance contact, somebody who's overseeing these activities. The fourth important element is conducting appropriate training and education, and I'm going to share some resources with you for that one. Number 5, responding appropriately to detected offenses and developing corrective action. A compliance program is no good if you identify an offense or some sort of misstep, or maybe it's blatant fraud, maybe it's an error, but it's abuse and you received reimbursement that you shouldn't have. Maybe it wasn't intentional, but you know about it. It's an overpayment, and when you find those issues, you need to correct them. And so you need to really have the fortitude and the spine, in my opinion, that your compliance program is set up in a way that when you detect things, you correct them. If you're not really in the mood for that, then this is probably not the session for you. The 6th element is developing open lines of communication. And what that means is that anyone in the organization, and maybe even outside the organization, if they observe some sort of non-compliance, maybe a patient even, that there's some open line of communication, maybe a hotline or some way to openly communicate without fear of repercussions. Maybe an employee is afraid of the doctor who's the owner. But if they have a legitimate concern, how can that concern be voiced in an effective way and then reviewed? Not all things that are reported through the hotline are substantiated, but you need to have that process in place. And then the 7th is enforcing disciplinary standards through well-publicized guidelines. Now, listen to what the OIG says. This sounds like a lot, right, for a small physician practice, and the OIG recognizes that. And they say, however, unlike other guidances issued by OIG, this guidance for physicians does not suggest that physician practices implement all 7 components of a full-scale compliance program. Instead, the guidance emphasizes a step-by-step approach to follow in developing and implementing a voluntary compliance program. This change is in recognition of the financial and staffing resource constraints faced by physician practices. The guidance should not be viewed as mandatory or as an all-inclusive discussion of the advisable components of a compliance program. Rather, the document is intended to present guidance to assist physician practices that voluntarily choose to develop a compliance program. They go on to talk about how they've limited the scope a little bit. The guidance is also limited in scope by focusing on the development of voluntary compliance programs for individual and small group physician practices. The difference between a small practice and a large practice cannot be determined by stating a particular number of physicians. Instead, our intent in narrowing the guidance to the small practices subset was to provide guidance to those physician practices whose financial or staffing resources would not allow them to implement a full-scale, institutionally structured compliance program as set forth in the third-party medical billing guidance or other previously released OIG guidance. So they're referencing these other guidance documents that they've also published. A compliance program can be an important tool for physician practices of all sizes and does not have to be costly, resource-intensive, or time-intensive. The extent of implementation will depend on the size and resources of the practice. Smaller practices may incorporate each of the components in a manner that best suits the practice. By contrast, larger physician practices often have the means to incorporate the components in a more systematic manner. So this is all straight from the OIG guidance. They're not saying don't do compliance, but they do recognize that small physician practices might need some flexibility in how this is approached. And this is something I found interesting as well. They said in situations where staffing limitations mandate that the practice cannot afford to designate a person to oversee compliance activities, the practice could outsource all or part of the functions of a compliance officer to a third party, such as a consultant. So you can always do that sort of thing as well. Now, you can't outsource the responsibility, right? You might outsource the expertise. I've done this before. There's many people who act as consultants in this way. You can't outsource the accountability and the responsibility of your practice. It's still your practice. It's still in the HIPAA context. It's still the PHI that you're housing. In the billing context, it's still your bills that you're submitting. So you can't say, oh, I hired this consultant and that's why we're non-compliant. The consultant acts as an expert to provide you with advice, but the practice really needs to be involved in the compliance program. So with that as a little bit of background, let's go through a couple of these elements that I think are especially important for physician practices. The first one is chart audits. And in a way, compliance, you just got to think through this and you got to follow the money. Where is the money coming in? And when it comes to chart audits, I think it's really important to not get overwhelmed and think you have to be perfect from day one, but you should probably focus your efforts on where your revenue is biggest. You, as a practice, know probably the 5 or 10 CPT codes that represent, 70% of your revenue. Start there. Start with, that 80-20 rule, the 80%, what represents 80% of our revenue. Now, the OIG feels it's important to emphasize the importance of proper claims. They said all healthcare providers have a duty to ensure that the claims submitted to the federal healthcare programs are true and accurate. I think some of this language has reference to the False Claims Act, because if the claims you're submitting are incorrect or false in some sort of way, that False Claims Act is a tool that enforcement agencies use to result in these large settlements and fines that you often see in the headlines. And there's a whistleblower component where it's called the key tam relator. It's somebody who has inside knowledge, can bring that to the government, and that whistleblower can get a percentage of the proceeds if there is a settlement. And so there's these incentives, and the government uses the False Claims Act. And so you really need to, if I were a single doc practicing, the number one risk is probably going to be the claims that I submit to Medicare and Medicaid or other federal healthcare programs. The OIG continues by saying an audit is an excellent way for a physician practice to ascertain what, if any, problem areas exist and focus on the risk areas that are associated with these problems. They go on to say, OIG recommended that a baseline or snapshot be used to enable a practice to judge over time its progress in reducing or eliminating potential areas of vulnerability. Now, what I've done in many of my professional roles full-time for organizations as well as a consultant is you do kind of a standard audit. You get benchmarking done, you get this baseline, and then you do repetitive audits, right? You may do them once a quarter. If there's a serious problem, you may need to do them more frequently. And you're checking to see how the errors are over time, okay? That shows the OIG, that shows enforcement agencies, and that shows your practice that you're serious about making sure your claims are true and accurate. These are some of the areas that the OIG recommends that you could do self audits, or again, you could have an external consultant or somebody do these for you. But they say the practice's self audits can be used to determine whether bills are accurately coded and accurately reflect the services provided as documented in the medical records. Secondly, documentation is being completed correctly. That's always an issue, is the documentation. You may have done the work, but if the documentation doesn't support it, you're going to have potential issues here. Third is services or items provided are reasonable and necessary. So you might be perfect in documenting, you might be perfect in coding, but if the service should have never been performed in the first place, that's called medical necessity not being met. So that's medically unnecessary services, and that happens a lot. And then the last item on this slide is any incentives for unnecessary services exist. You want to check to see all financial relationships. So, for example, there's been a lot of settlements recently, physicians who have been speakers for drug companies, and the money coming in from those drug companies to pay you as a physician, as a speaker, may have the intent to influence your prescribing patterns of that drug. I've done a webinar on this before. It's called Doctors and Drug Money. And so you can listen to the details in another video. But those types of outside influences, those financial influences, also can taint claims. So you got to be careful with those as well. Additionally, on this auditing and monitoring, a lot of people ask, well, how many charts should I audit? What should I do? OIG says, although there is no set formula to how many medical records should be reviewed, as a basic guide is 5 or more medical records per federal payer, i.e. Medicare, Medicaid, or 10 to 5 medical records per physician. That should be a very absolute minimum. In my experience, as I'm working with clients across the country and in the work I've done full-time at health organizations, we were doing 10 records per physician per quarter. And then that was just the baseline. And then if a physician had a problem, we'd had to do some education, and then we'd have to re-audit, and that re-audit might take place in a week or 2 weeks or something, or you put a hold on the claims before you bill them so that you can make sure claims are accurate. So the OIG goes on to say, of course, the larger the sample size, the larger the comfort level that the physician practice will have about the results. And I think that makes sense to most people. See, there's no set formula, but doing something that makes sense based off the results you get, based off of the revenue you're generating. As I said, a lot of times I started with, okay, let's look at your 5 CPT codes that represent the majority of your revenue. And let's start there. Let's not, look for the needle in the haystack right off the bat, right? Let's look at, the core of the work that you do. Now, who should do these audits? The OIG says, the individuals from the physician practice involved in these self-audits would ideally include the person in charge of billing, if the practice has such a person, and a medically trained person, e.g. registered nurse or preferably a physician. Physicians can rotate in this position. So I think this is a really important one, especially for items of medical necessity. A lot of coders are not necessarily trained to determine if a procedure is medically necessary. And so it's important that you get somebody with some training, some clinical expertise that can, say, that heart cath shouldn't have been done, or, that injection and the frequency that you're doing these injections would not really be considered medically necessary, and those sorts of things. So audits, I think, is the number one thing that small physician practices can do. The second area I wanted to talk about is employee training. This is so important that you can demonstrate to enforcement agencies that you are trying to train your employees to do things the right way. The OIG said this. They said, it is in the practice's best interest to ensure that individuals who are directly involved with billing, coding, or other aspects of the federal healthcare programs receive extensive education specific to that individual's responsibilities. So if you have somebody who is overseeing your coding and billing, what are their credentials? What kind of continuing education do they get? Because coding and billing rules change regularly. So they need to be up to date and staying up to date. The other thing I'm going to talk about in a few slides is HIPAA. So if you have a person who oversees your medical records, what kind of training do they have specific to HIPAA regulations and requirements? So I think that's what the OIG is getting at here, making sure that you get training done. And again, that can be done in-house. It can be done by a consultant. You can do all sorts of ways to get the training done. But the point is that you need to make sure you've documented that your employees are getting training. Now, I often get asked, what should the training encompass? What topics? OIG says both initial and recurrent training in compliance is advisable. What they're saying is it's not a one and done type of thing. You should probably do it on a regular basis, at least once a year. I'm a proponent of doing them, making them training shorter, but doing them more frequently so that it's kind of always in your mind. Maybe there's a monthly, 5-minute or 10-minute training on a certain topic. These topics listed here are some of the things that you should probably be training your physicians and employees on. Various coding and billing regulations, medical necessity. Remember, I was talking about that. HIPAA. And included in HIPAA is privacy, security, and breach notification. These are separate rules found within HIPAA. I'm going to talk about HIPAA a little deeper in the next section. The anti-kickback statute, the Stark Law, which is the physician self-referral law, conflicts of interest, and then some general fraud, waste, and abuse knowledge is also usually important. These are just some common things that I've seen and that I've done, but if you have an issue with a particular thing, that's what you need to do your training on. So that's why doing like an overall risk assessment is really important. Finding out where you're strong and where you're weak, and then focusing your efforts on those weaker points. Here are some resources that the OIG has made available. On the left, you can see a roadmap for new physicians. This is a downloadable PDF document. It's a pretty quick read, but it goes through a lot of the high-level type of issues that can happen in fraud and abuse. And then on the right, the OIG has provided a draft slide deck that you can download and use. PowerPoint presentation. They also have speaker notes that accompany this. So I've given you some links here. These are some starting points. Again, these are kind of off the shelf, kind of broad, applies to everybody. But I think training that's focused on the strengths and weaknesses of your practice is more important. So if you're not doing any training, this might be a good start. If you want to kind of boost your training and kick it up a level, you want to start doing some focused training. So let's move on to our third and last section of this session, which is HIPAA compliance. We've talked a lot about billing and coding, following the money, and that is probably your number one risk. But HIPAA compliance, though there may not be direct money in claims, there are definitely fines. And the enforcement body for HIPAA, OCR, Office for Civil Rights, under HHS, has been doing a lot of enforcement in HIPAA compliance. And anyone who's a covered entity has to know the HIPAA rules. You can read about recent headlines. This is just one example of a small healthcare provider that failed to implement multiple HIPAA security rule requirements. They were fined $25,000. They entered into a corrective action plan, which also is burdensome and pricey. And these types of press releases are common. I'm not going to dive into the details of this particular issue. I've done another video specifically on one requirement of the security rule called a risk analysis. And I recommend that you watch that video because that's one of the requirements that a lot of people are missing. But the director of OCR said this: healthcare providers owe it to their patients to comply with the HIPAA rules. When informed of potential HIPAA violations, providers owe it to their patients to quickly address problem areas to safeguard individuals' health information. That's what the OCR was saying in reference to that last settlement with the health provider. What are some common HIPAA issues that I see? The number one is probably the one I listed first, which is a failure to complete a comprehensive system-wide HIPAA security risk assessment and management plan. A risk assessment is kind of like, I've used this analogy with a lot of people, when you're buying a home, before you close on that home, you usually will do a home inspection, right? You get somebody who knows building codes and electricity and plumbing and roof quality and foundation issues. You get somebody to come in and to inspect the home. Then they provide a report to you, and it might say, oh yeah, the roof, doesn't need to be replaced tomorrow, but it probably needs to be replaced in the next 5 to 10 years. Your electricity looks good. The plumbing is fine. The foundation is all good except for the northwest corner has this issue. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but you might need to get it taken care of in the next 3 years. So you get this home inspection that looks at the whole home and tells you of the areas that might have some risks. That's what a HIPAA security risk assessment is in relation to electronic PHI. PHI is protected health information. This is the information that you as a covered entity have to protect. And the HIPAA security rule says you must do a risk assessment of your entire organization to determine where you might have some weaknesses and what needs to be strengthened, and then you develop a management plan. The second thing I've listed is it's a part of an initiative that the OCR is undergoing right now. They've posted over the last 2 years more than 20 settlements about right of access. Now, patients have a right to access their information. And there are HIPAA rules that state that you have to provide that information when a request is made within a certain time frame. And the rules change a little bit, the timelines change a little bit. So I'm not going to give you kind of a black and white rule right now, but you have deadlines to meet. And when you don't meet those deadlines, patients can complain. They can complain to OCR. OCR then can do an investigation, and you get these settlements and corrective action plans that you have to do. And if you go to the OCR website and look in their newsroom, you'll see all of the recent headlines of right of access issues. So that's the second common HIPAA issue I see. Some others here are failure to implement security measures to reduce risks and vulnerabilities. So once you've identified a potential security risk, what have you done to address it? Maybe you need it. You've got 6 laptops and none of them are encrypted. Well, that's an identification of a potential risk. You should encrypt those laptops. Failure to prevent unauthorized access to EPHI. And the last one is failure to record and examine activity in information systems with EPHI. That last one's particularly important because there's a lot of bad actors out there, hackers who want this information. And part of your job is to be assessing who's in your medical record, who is in your IT systems, and what kind of activity is going on there. So there needs to be some monitoring of those systems that contain EPHI. And when you fail to do that, you could have a bad actor lurking around that has hacked either through phishing or some sort of activity has gotten access to your system. OCR director said this, and this is one that I have to agree with because I see it a lot in my work. Laptops, cell phones, and other mobile devices are stolen every day. That's the hard reality. Covered entities can best protect their patients' data by encrypting mobile devices to thwart identity thieves. These mobile items, flash drives, USB drives, these things are going to get lost, they're going to get stolen, and if it's not encrypted, it's going to be a presumed breach, more or less, and you're going to have some reporting that you have to do publicly. So it's best just to be upfront. Just like I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, compliance programs are preventive medicine. Let's prevent these things rather than trying to deal with a huge nightmare and mess when a laptop gets stolen. And then the last thing that the OCR director said is the failure to implement basic HIPAA requirements, such as an accurate and thorough risk analysis and risk management plan, continues to be an unacceptable and disturbing trend within the healthcare industry. That's why I've titled this slide, Perform a Risk Analysis. This is probably one of the most commonly cited failures when the OCR does investigations, is that you haven't done a proper risk analysis. So that's kind of my push, my cheerleading to you is to perform a risk analysis. Watch our other video where I dive deeper into this topic of the importance of performing a risk analysis, as well as enforcement examples of healthcare providers who did not perform one and what kind of penalties they paid. This is one that you should do. I recommend you do it annually. At least do one. You have to have one on record, and then you have to update them as appropriate, depending on changes in the environment and those sorts of things. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight for small physician practices, where I might start and what I might recommend. If you have questions, please send them to info@compliancereality.com. And again, if you need help with your compliance program, please consider our consulting and training services. Again, you can reach us at info@compliancereality.com. Thanks for listening to another episode, and we hope you join us again.